It's not very common for a game to come out to an absolute firestorm of hate that Forspoken was subjected to on its release. The game was panned by players and critics for numerous reasons ranging from technical, the writing, the plot. In fact, the game only scored a 64 on Metacritic for its PS5 review. Now, of course, reading the different takes that both critics and players had on the game was completely unavoidable. Opening up any social media app, and there were endless clips highlighting the game's terrible dialogue and cringy main character. Believe it or not, it's now been nearly 2 years since the game's release, and I want to go back and play the game for myself. I want to experience Forspoken from start to finish. Now, before jumping into the review, let's first get a brief overview of the developer. Luminous Productions, originally known as Business Division 2, a subsidiary of the parent company Square Enix, had first developed Final Fantasy 15. As we know, that game received a somewhat mixed reaction, still got an 81 on Metacritic for its PS4 release, but that's pretty low as far as the standard goes for Final Fantasy. They moved on to the development of Forspoken, or otherwise known as Project Athia, in 2018. I won't go into details of all of its development, but it's worth mentioning that the game did get delayed from its initial release date of May 24, 2022 to October 11th, 2022, and then it was delayed once again to January 24th, 2023, so it was pushed out almost a year from its initial release. The game came out to below average reviews both on PC and PS5 and was dragged through the mud on social media endlessly. For that same reason, the game struggled mightily in sales, with Square Enix calling the game a considerable down risk to their fiscal earnings. Shortly after the failure of Forspoken, Square Enix announced that Luminous Productions would reorganize and merge with the parent company. That's all to say that not a single positive thing resulted from Forspoken, but nonetheless, let's jump into the review. So, Forspoken takes place in an alternate world known as Athia. Well, the game doesn't actually start there. In fact, you start out in New York City, and after running into some bad luck, and by bad luck, I mean having your apartment set fire to and having the bag of cash you've been hoarding in order to start a new life being completely destroyed. After some time, Frey manages to stumble across the cuff sitting in a room, and after grabbing it and slipping it on, only then does the game actually start, as you're transported to Athia. Now, I came into the game knowing how bad the writing, dialogue, story, and characters all are. And when I go into the game, I like to go into it completely blind so that I can form an objective opinion, not so that I can pick out examples that lean into the, oh man, this story sucks bias. With that being said, however, Forspoken's story is extremely bland. There genuinely isn't anything of substance that happens that managed to grip me in any way. I hate to dogpile on a game that's already been through the ringer, but the story is about as bare bones as I had anticipated. To add to that, Forspoken has to have some of the worst writing I've come across in gaming, and that's even after playing Dragon Age the Veilguard. I can sit here and pick out obvious examples, but Frey and her Cuff's banter just isn't funny, and half the time they're just trying to one-up each other in a very annoying way. Frey herself is terribly written. I get it, she's supposed to be a millennial or Gen Z girl, and the writing reflects that, but the juxtaposition of being in this fantasy world and Frey's writing just doesn't mesh at all. I totally get what the writers were going for, but it is a complete miss. Characters just aren't that interesting. There are a few consistent characters who are there throughout the story, but they really never develop into anyone worth listening to. There were times I would be watching a cutscene and not understanding a single thing that was happening because I was so tuned out. A lot of the story is told through these codex entries and lore you pick up from around the world, and if you're someone who likes reading those types of things, then Forspoken will definitely quench that thirst for you. All in all though, I would definitely not recommend a playthrough of Forspoken just for the story alone. It's not all bad though. If there's one thing Forspoken does well in, it's gameplay. Of course, these were the developers of Final Fantasy 15, which was an action role-playing game, so combat can be considered something that the devs were good at, and it definitely translated well into Forspoken. It's all very active. You're constantly on the move, casting all sorts of abilities from 4 different schools of magic, all while dodging and maneuvering around the battlefield brilliantly. I found the combat in general to be very fun and something I looked forward to in between my travels from mission to mission. To break it down further, Frey's Cuff has given her the ability to cast all sorts of spells ranging from fire, earth, water, and lightning. Each school of magic comes with a number of different support spells and offensive spells, as well as an ultimate attack of sorts that can be triggered once the meter's full. It all blends together beautifully. Switching between the various schools of magic is a breeze, and stringing together spells felt great. There is even a grading system akin to Devil May Cry or Bayonetta that rewards you with more XP and material drop rate for stringing together different attack types and avoiding damage successfully. Dodging and evading is very simply done just by holding down the O button. I think this is a similar mechanic to Final Fantasy 15 if I'm not mistaken, but it doesn't require much effort to avoid damage. Enemies range from being very easy adds that would be lucky to damage you to larger, more demanding fights that include open world and dungeon boss. Each of these different enemies have their own resistances, and this information is done by locking onto an enemy and scanning them with your cuff, revealing a bit of info about them and giving you advice on how to take them down. Some enemies may be vulnerable to fire, while another one may take most damage from lightning. It's all pretty fundamental, but I generally like having these systems in game. It gives the player a reason to try out the different spells and strategies, so it's a nice touch to have. With that being said though, combat was definitely Forspoken's strong suit, and something I had trouble finding any fault in. I think if you're a gamer who enjoys fast-paced, fluid, and flashy combat, then Forspoken may have something for you if you look past all the other parts. Leveling in Forspoken is pretty straightforward. See, as you level, you gain a currency of some sort known as mana. You use this mana to spend within various skill trees in order to level up your spells. It's all relatively simple. As you work your way down a skill tree, you'll find stronger versions of existing spells, which of course cost more mana in order to unlock. Luckily, mana is pretty easy to come by, as the open world and dungeons alike have mana pools scattered around so that they add to your total count once they're picked up. With that being said, the progression is pretty linear. You're really only ever going to use your mana points to increase your spell level. There isn't any alternate skill trees or paths you can take outside of the 4 schools of magic. What's there is pretty basic, but it's not something that will require lots of theory crafting or second guessing. You can refund any purchase you make, so if you end up picking a skill that you're not very fond of, then you can simply get your mana back for it. The game does have an equipment system as well, which interacts with the various schools of magic. To start out, you have your cloak, which has their own properties such as attacks being boosted after using a healing item or having your critical attack cause poison damage. The cloaks can also be modified through the crafting and upgrade system, allowing you to tack on an additional bonus to your health, damage, or an additional property. Similarly, you have a necklace slot, which, like the cloak, will grant you some type of modifier like increasing the effects of a certain school of magic, and you can also augment the necklace to have more property. There is also fingernail designs, which offer up more gameplay modifiers like killing blows generating a shockwave, and combining these 3 different equipment slots gives you ability to somewhat form your own build, but don't go in expecting a large amount of depth here. The equipment and the properties that can be used are all very surface level, and interplay between the equipment pieces themselves are very limited. I personally would have liked to see a couple of things. Firstly, there should have definitely been more equipment slots and lootable items as well. Forspoken is the perfect type of playground game that will allow a player to experiment with different item combinations. Secondly, I think the actual properties could have been more interesting. A bland crit rate increase or a 2% damage boost just isn't exciting for me at all. It's honestly a shame because the combat is so well done, but the equipment system just does not reach that same level of depth. The open world of Forspoken is large, and thankfully it has a ton of things to do in it. The map is just dotted with activities from dungeons to open world bosses to locked chests and more. It would take you probably twice as long, if not 3 times as long, to finish all these side activities in comparison to the main story. Thankfully, the map does have a checklist for each of these different regions you find yourself in to let you know what you've completed and what still needs to be done. My personal favorite side activities were the locked labyrinths. These were dungeon areas that you go into, usually wipe out a couple of rooms filled with enemies, then take on a final boss at the end of the dungeon. Unfortunately, all these locked labyrinths basically look the same, which totally makes sense because the game developers did use some sort of procedural generation system in the game, and outside of the actual open world, I'd wager that these locked labyrinths were included in that procedural generation. Regardless, I found these fun as I was able to test my spells out and get a reward at the end of it. The open world itself isn't really anything special. There are a number of different biomes you'll come across with some features that show the distinction from one to another, but nothing caught my eye or made me sit back and think, wow, this area looks really good. Going from area to area is fine. You'll be doing a lot of the travel on foot, but as you defeat the Tantas and unlock new abilities, you'll be able to travel quicker and quicker. Either way, I found myself most often just running around, and sometimes the distance from mission to mission is quite long. Thankfully, there is a fast travel system, which include the safe houses that you can craft and rest at. Overall, the open world itself is fine. It's honestly very generic, and nothing stood out to me as being different or unique from other open world games. It feels like an open world just for the sake of being an open world. Graphically, the game is a tale of two sides. The character models, the enemies, the open world all look pretty bland to me. Frey herself just looks weird in a lot of cutscenes, and actually that goes for most of the characters. The open world doesn't look that great. And to be clear, I was playing on my PS5 in performance mode, so that might have definitely added to the overall washed out effect that I was encountering, but the art style itself just wasn't vibrant. There are a lot of grays and browns all over the place. The magic effect, on the other hand, are great. The fire, lightning, and water effect, they all look great, and pulling all these spells off together and seeing the after effects was awesome. In general though, because there's far more open world and character cutscenes than there are spell effects, the game just isn't impressive graphically. I honestly couldn't shake this strange feeling of the game being some sort of tech demo for that Luminous engine. Alright, let's wrap this up. Forspoken is honestly an interesting game. The combat is very well done. I enjoyed basically being a hyperactive battle mage who can wield all sorts of elemental spells. On the other hand, the story, the characters, and the world were just so boring and bland. There were times I was looking at the screen and I had no idea what was going on. The game takes a while to get going, upwards of 3 hours until you're free to do what you want, and nearly halfway through the main story until you've picked up your third school of magic. The pacing just is completely off. The main story itself took me only around 13 hours to complete, which surprised me at just how short it was. By the time I got to the final chapter, I felt like I was barely getting started. The game, however, is full of side content, much of which are just combat arenas that are approached differently, whether it be through the labyrinth or an open world boss fight. There are side quests, none of which are even remotely worth doing outside of some small XP games. Honestly, open world games that lack any inspiration are a complete slog to go through, and Forspoken unfortunately fits that build perfectly. My overall feeling on Forspoken is still mixed because I enjoyed the combat as much as I did, but I genuinely cannot recommend to anyone that they buy Forspoken unless they really want to experience the combat for themselves. Other than that, there really isn't anything worth playing here. So that's going to wrap up my Forspoken review. Thank you all for watching. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button. If you're new here, subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one.